皆さん、すみません、また今週も、始まりましたソフォススレッドハンティングアカデミーの時間になりましたので、ウェビナーの方を開始したいと思います。はい、改めまして、皆さん、先週から引き続き、ご参加いただきましてありがとうございます。私、ソフォスセールスエンジニアリング本部と、今回担当いたします、三浦のお二人でやりますので、よろしくお願いいたします。よ
ろしくお願いいたします。
はい、ではですね、今週のですね、スレッドハンティングアカデミー、Day2 としてお題目として、問題点の整理という形で、今日はお話をしたいなと思っております。はい、でまたですね、先週と同様にですね、前半すみません、37分ほどですね、動画を流します。で、今回はですね、前回は初動対応ということで、弊社ラピッドレスポンスのチームとして、ソフォス製品を入れてないお客様が、ラピッドレスポンスチームに、依頼をかけまして、ソフォスのエージェントを入れまして、で、問題調査及び、初動対応として、不審なものの特定と削除を行ったというようなことを、一連の流れの説明をしましたと。で、今回はですね、もう少しそこを深掘りしてですね、なぜそのように、その時に対して、どのような考え方とか、その考え方をもとにしてどういったアクションを取ったのか、そのようなことを質問形式でですね、プロダクトの SE と、プロダクトソリューションを考える SE 部隊と、あとは前回、喋っております、ラピッドレスポンスチームの、リーダーの方ですね。そこの会話ベースで話を続けていくような形で、最初見ていただきます。で、後半ですね、また XDR のクエリの話をですね、三浦の方でデモして、しながらですね、こんなことやるんだなという風で、皆さんも実感していただくような形の構成となっておりますので、よろしくお願いいたします。で、ちょっとだけ、先週もお話ししたところですけど、ちょっと再びおさらいです。今回、喋りますラピッドレスポンスサービスなんですけども、要は、火消しのサービスになるものでして、24時間365日、消火活動を行う、EV3 インシデントレスポンス対応を行うチームになっています。で、その先、定常監視のモードになりますと、我々が、やっております、ソフォス MTR のサービスの方ですね。そういったと同様な、定常監視というようなところを、45日間提供するようなものになっています。で、また、前回のちょっとフィードバックのところでもあったので、もう一回説明をするんですけども、MTR というサービスとラピッドレスポンスサービス、2つ今、ソフォス持っています。で、主眼としているものとして、目的としてはということで、マネージスレットレスポンス、MTR というふうに略していますけども、こちらはインシデントが発生しないように24時間365日監視するサービスになってまして、一方でラピッドレスポンスについては、もうインシデントが発生しているときに、中和化する対応から、MTR と一緒ですね、定常監視のところを45日間限定ということで、行っているサービスですと。で、今回喋っている方は、こっちのところの、ベースのところでの話になっておりますといったところで、実際に動画の方を進めたいと思いますので、よろしくお願いいたします。
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining, everybody. Peter, thank you for joining as well. And I just want to kind of recap a little bit of the session that we did previously. Was a little bit of a scratching the surface, and I really want to deep dive into a couple questions that have come up, as well as go into a couple techniques that that you've basically been using, and sort of share your expertise on that. So thanks a lot, Peter. One of the things that was kind of skipped over, and frankly, rightfully so, it's a little bit boring, is when dealing with an incident where a customer actually hasn't been using Sophos software in the past. One of the first things that actually gets or needs to get done is obviously the rollout of the agent onto their systems. Obviously, we didn't cover that because that's kind of boring. But what team is sort of responsible for that, and what does that sort of look like?
Yeah, the Rapid Response Service includes another team called the Rapid Deployment Team. They work hand in hand with us. So their job is to get Sophos installed on ideally 100% of machines, but as many machines as quickly as possible, for the obvious reasons of it will speed us up, we'll have better protection, better visibility, and that visibility is key to making sure that if we find something, we can see if it's running anywhere else, and we can make sure we take control of the entire estate and really kick the attacker out of everywhere, not just the one machine we're looking at. So getting the agent deployed quickly is essential. Our deployment teams concentrate on what we call mass deployments, so things like using a GPO or PDQ or various other tools. Normally we try and use the tool the existing customer or the organization are already familiar with. You know, most companies out there will have a tool for installing applications, so we'll normally go with that because it's already there and the customer knows how to use it. But yeah, getting installed as quickly as possible helps in so many ways, but it's also not essential. We don't have to wait for the agent to be on there to start. We can run some other offline standalone tools just to go and start collecting that evidence and start investigating what's happened. But yeah, things dramatically speed up once we've got the agents installed.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that. So you guys can obviously work in parallel, right? Your team isn't necessarily waiting for the entire rollout to be complete on 100% of the systems or anything like that, or as many as
Absolutely
you can get.
not.
You guys can do parallel work as that rollout is progressing. Is that right?
Yeah, the idea is, you know, as soon as we start getting installed, we're going to concentrate on the critical infrastructure first. So the ones that maybe are known to have been impacted by the attack, as well as things like domain controllers, and then normally it's onto email servers, accounting, whatever is important to the actual organization. But yeah, as soon as we start getting some visibility into the network, that allows us to start looking everywhere for it. And then as more machines come online, we look at those for what we've already identified to see if it's on them as well.
Great, that really clarifies that. As I mentioned before, you guys obviously get involved in a lot of new customer scenarios as well as existing customer scenarios. Apart from having to initially roll out the client, what do you think the main difference is between how you approach those scenarios? Like what data is there, that what you're looking at? Like what's the major advantage of having Sophos installed ahead of time from an investigation point of view?
Yeah, well, even when they're an existing customer, we normally find there are some machines that didn't have the agent installed for various reasons. So we have a lot of similarity between existing and new customers. The biggest advantage, obviously, other than the obvious, like you say, good protection, it's the journals. So the Sophos data recorder that's recording information that happens on the machine, so processes being executed, files being accessed, network connections being made, login events, all of this really valuable data going back as far as, well, 3 months or often a lot longer. That gives us incredible insight, and it gives it to us incredibly quickly. You know, if we have something on the machine, we want to know where it came from or what IP addresses it's being talking to. We have that data and we can access it via the console. We don't have to go to the machine, we can do it all remotely. So it's very fast. When you don't have that and you have to rely on the sort of core elements of, let's say, a Windows operating system and the information it's recorded, maybe event logs or various other places you can look at on a machine, you are limited. You know, most of these things we look at on a Windows machine aren't actually designed to be sort of a forensic audit of what's happened. They just can be used to give us clues as to what happened. And of course, you know, if you're talking event logs, those may have been wiped by the attacker, which is very easy to do. So yeah, it's the amount of data available to help us understand what's happened is the big difference.
No, that totally makes sense, and obviously the more data that you can access, the more sure you can be of obviously what went on. I know that you mentioned 3 months or more on my end systems. Obviously depends on system activity, but I've got logs going back probably about a year. And it's also, I think, important to note that it doesn't necessarily need to be a full XDR client for those journals to be available, right? They can just have InterceptX and those journals get generated because they're generated for other reasons.
Exactly. For anyone that is familiar with the InterceptX product and the Threat Analysis Center, you've got a section called Threat Graphs. That is a sort of an automated graph to show you what happened leading up to an event. So something gets detected, we use the data we've already recorded to say, well, that file was written by this process, which executed this command and connected to this IP address. Those are only possible because we're already recording the information. So having Intercept X gives you that data. Having XDR gives you the ability to query that data via the console.
Right. So it's generated anyway. It just gives you the ability to go off on another investigation thread, much as you're doing right now.
Yeah, and as you say, we say 3 months, but it's not time based. It is volume based, so they can go much longer.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that you wanted to dive into some stuff and show us a little bit deeper into some areas. So let's go ahead and get started with that.
Yeah, so a recap on the previous session. So we've got this test environment, the WWE Hotel as it's called, and it has been attacked. They weren't using Sophos at the time of the attack, and we've installed Sophos since then. What we knew at the beginning was that they had some sort of ransomware attack and files had been encrypted. That was all we knew. What we discovered in the previous session was that they had a vulnerable Exchange server, vulnerable to the proxy shell vulnerability. So we saw a web shell get detected on there. So potential signs that that's how they gained access to the network. We also found evidence of the encrypted files that have a .pwned extension on the end, as well as the ransom note called readme.txt dropped in various places. We also saw signs of some of the tools they may have been using. So there was the installer for TeamViewer, as well as WinRAR and PSExec, as well as some odd files on the domain controller, things like kill.bat and start.bat. So we want to obviously look a bit more at those. What the actions we took from the first session was that we isolated the Exchange server because we'd seen the evidence, it was vulnerable, it had been exploited, there was the web shell on there, so we wanted to make sure that that was taken away. We found that one of the accounts they'd been using was called Exchange Admin, and they were still logged in, so we logged them off. We also found, importantly, a file called svchost.exe, not the legitimate one that we believe is the ransomware. So Sophos was already detecting that, but we also put in a block for the file just to be on the safe side as well. So what we're going to start with today, we're going to go to the Threat Analysis Center and we're going to go to Live Discover. This is that ability in XDR to query machines. And there's categories of queries and hundreds of queries in here. And as I said previously, the ones in the rapid response category, which you won't see by default, they're all published on our GitHub. Just go to GitHub, Sophos Rapid Response, you'll find them. But what I will do is just create a brand new query to get us started. So I'm going to call it processes. And I'm going to put it into the processes category. I'll skip the description for now, and I will say this is a Windows one, and I'm going to say select processes. Ooh, processes, if I spell it right. There we go. So anyone fans of SQL will realize that's a very simple query. And I'm just going to go and select the machines I want it to run on. We've got 4 machines here. There could be thousands in here. It doesn't make any difference. I'm going to click run, and it's going to go live out to these machines, run that query on them, and then return the data. This is all live. This isn't coming to like the Sophos cloud and getting data. It's actually going out to the individual machines. And I've now got the data coming back. This is the processes that are actually running on these machines right now. We've got, let's just see if they, okay, 4 have responded. There's the data. So these are the processes running right now. If, for example, we wanted to know, hey, is anyone using TeamViewer on our machines right now? Because we've seen the attacker potentially using that. So let's go select all from processes where name like, and we use a wildcard, name like team, and we'll see if there is anything running on these machines with the word team in the name. And think about it, and there you go. 4 have responded saying nothing's been sent. There is no one running TeamViewer right now. Just to prove that works, let's do Explorer. Let's just make sure we can actually get data for a specific thing. I assume Explorer's running on these machines. Oh no, maybe not. Did I spell it wrong? No, let's go svc host, not the ransomware, just the normal. And here we go. There we go. So yeah, svc host running gives you all the details, where it's running from, and various other details. You can scroll to the right. There's lots of data here. So that's, very easy. It's not pretty because it's just a select all, but we've now ruled out that nobody is running TeamViewer on any of these machines right now. So that's good. But we also want to continue investigating. So what we're going to do now is we're going to run a query to look at PowerShell and what interesting PowerShell things may have been executed recently. So I'm just going to go to the list of the queries we like using, and we're going to go back and we're going to run this query. And this is going into the event log, so this isn't into the Sophos journals. Remember, the Sophos wasn't installed on these machines at the time, so it's just collecting the data that is available on these machines. And
right, so this will be on machines that have Sophos and didn't have Sophos in the past, right?
Yeah, exactly. Sophos is installed on now. That's how we're able to collect the data, but it didn't have at the time of the attack. And let me just see if I can filter this, or sort this, I should say. And I think I want the other way around. So with this query, we already highlight some things that we believe are potentially suspicious. And I think if we export to Excel, this will be an easier view. And we'll see what kind of PowerShell commands have been executing recently. There we go.
Yeah, again, as you said, there's multiple ways of getting the same information, right? There's the data that would be about this in our own journals. There's data that's about that is about PowerShell executions in Windows event logs as well. So it's kind of, your queries are basically getting the data that it's trying to get the data out of where it is in a lot of different cases. There's multiple ways of doing this, right?
Yeah, exactly. And here we can see various things. I mean, lots of these are completely legitimate. You can see they're absolutely, well, if you're familiar with looking at PowerShell, a lot of this stuff is what you'd expect. But you never know. You have to look, because we don't know what we're looking for at the beginning. So we have to investigate and see if there's anything potentially interesting in here. Now, I was looking for, see if they've done anything with Defender, but apparently not. So that's a good way of getting data out of event logs, especially PowerShell and things like that. But we also want to look at what services have been installed recently. So whenever software gets installed, quite often it'll install services. So we have another query down here for looking at suspicious service installs. So let me just go, I think I've just gone past it, haven't I? I think alphabetical would be easy, but not always. There we go, suspicious services being installed. So when a service gets installed on a Windows machine, it creates a 7045 event in the system event log. So this is going in and looking at those and pulling back data about those. Now, what we can see here, and they're still doing it on a few machines, we can see a PSExec service has been installed. And we get the time it was installed, and we get the user account that installed it. Now, for those familiar with PSExec, you'll know it's a legitimate admin tool, Microsoft tool for executing commands. And what it's most commonly used for is executing commands across a network. The way that that actually works is on your machine where you're executing the command, you run the PSExec command. On the remote machine that is going to run that command, it installs a service to run that command. So at the time the command is being told to run, the service gets installed, the command gets run, and that event gets logged. So we can see that someone, well, administrator, was executing commands across the network using PSExec, and the result was these services. What we can't see from here is what the commands were or where they were being executed from.
Right.
But we can see when they're installed, and that means we can also look at the login information, because when these services get installed, the first thing that happens is the administrator account has to log into the machine. So if we go pull the login information, we can see where did they log in from.
So just to clarify a little bit, every single time you run a PSExec command against a remote machine, that remote machine installs the PSExec service, and that's generating that event ID, and that's what you just pulled, right? So all those service installs are essentially remote PSExec commands that have been run on these 3 machines.
Yeah.
Right.
And what we're now going to run is a query to pull in all the login information out of the event log. So we know we're looking for administrator, but I'm just going to wildcard it, and I'm going to bring everything back from all 4 machines. So I'm going to run. Okay, we'll wait for that data to come back. Remember, this is all happening in real time, so there's no trickery here. The data comes back in a matter of seconds, and again, we'll just wait until we've got 3 machines. Which one we're waiting for the DC to finish? Yep, there we go. We definitely want the DC. So again, let's have a look at that data.
So on the first hand, you've got services being installed, but it doesn't tell you what the command was or the source machine that it was run from, correct?
From the PSExec services, yeah, you can't see where it's coming from or what the command is yet, but you can see, importantly, you can see when installed and onto which machine. So if we take this one here as an example, so on the Exchange server, it installed at that time, 10:35 and 45 seconds. Now we've got all of this lovely logging information. So let's, first of all, filter it to just the Exchange server. So let's get that one. And now let's just do a simple Control F and see if we've got any at that time. Yes, we do. And we have a few at that time. So if we select all the 45s, yeah, so yeah, here we go. So administrator from the domain controller successfully logged in at that same second to the Exchange server.
Right. So you're essentially correlating these 2 events, one for the service creation and the other one for the logon that happens pretty much every single time you run PSExec. You're having to log on with admin, and then that service gets created. So you're essentially correlating those 2 events to try to answer one of those questions, which is where it's coming from,
And that's, I mean, seeing it once is a good indication, but it's not confirmation. We want to see that this isn't just a one-off and it's actually, replicating on the other machines that saw the same thing. So let's just, this time is for the file server. And yes, we have administrator logging in again, same second to the file server from the domain controller. That makes sense. Normally an attacker will launch their attack from the domain controller. Also, we store the installer file for PSExec on the domain controller and those other interesting files. So very likely this is how the attack was deployed, using PSExec from the domain controller and the administrator account. But we want to really go in and verify that. So let's go and do what's called a live response session to the domain controller. We want to actually have a look at those suspicious files that were in the Windows temp directory, that kill.bat and start.bat, and it was list.txt as well. So obviously you could walk over to the server and have a look at it, or you could use whatever remote administration tools you have, but you can also do it directly from the Sophos console with this live response feature. So it gives us command line access to the machine. So we're on the domain controller here. Let's go and look at the Windows temp directory. Let's do dir, and we can see, yeah, there's kill.bat, list.txt, and start.bat as well. So be very careful when you use this command. You have to type the word type. Don't forget that, otherwise you'll end up just executing the batch script. But we're going to have a look at the contents of this batch script, and there's a lot of stuff in here. We have got, so we've got some delete keys. So they're disabling Windows Defender. First thing, that's what they do, disable real-time monitoring. They're then going in and doing net stops on SQL and lots of other applications by the looks of things, Exchange. And what else are they doing? And then some task kills on a bunch of different things as well. This is what we would class this as a kill script. This is preparation for ransomware, basically. This is making sure as much can be encrypted as possible, because it's difficult to encrypt things that are currently in use, like Exchange databases and SQL databases and things like
exactly. If you're wanting to encrypt a SQL database, one of the first things you want to do is stop the SQL service to be able to write to the database directly, right?
Yeah, so this is a good sign of them preparing the machine for encryption. Let's have a look at list.txt. Let's see what was in there. It's a list of IP addresses. We know we saw the installer for advanced IP scanner on the Exchange server. So most likely they ran that, generated a list of machines on our domain, and then created a list file to try and do bad stuff to them. Last file is called start.bat. Let's have a look at that one. So here we've got it going into a for loop. So we're looping through the list of IP addresses. So it's going through each one of those IP addresses, and then it's using psexec to silently accept the EULA and copy kill.bat to the machine and execute it. And then it's doing the same psexec, but also taking that SVC host file, the one that we believe was the ransomware, and executing that. And it looks like they're also passing a command to, I'm guessing, say, just encrypt the user's directory, because that was the only place we saw encrypted files as well.
So this kind of makes sense. Is before, when you ran that psexec service installation query, you got 2 results per system.
Yeah.
And given that there's essentially 2 psexec commands run on a per system basis, now that's starting to line up.
Yeah, it installs a service for each one. So now what we've got is how they deployed the ransomware, where they deployed it from, and which account. So we can feel very confident that we now understand the ransomware part of this attack and we've stopped it. But we still want to understand where else have they been. We know we saw things like WinRAR being installed, or at least the installer being on the file server. That's concerning because that indicates they may have been about to try and take data from there. So we want to know where else they've been. We also haven't confirmed that this did all start in the Exchange server. So we want to look a bit more at the logins. So we've already got that data here. So let's just go back, remove that filter, and let's start with the administrator account. So we know administrator has been doing bad things. So let's just go and see what they've been doing, or he's been doing, or she's been doing. So lots of different logins to various machines. And we want to narrow this down. So let's start by looking at RDP logs or RDP logins. So 1149 in the terminal services event logs, which is a great resource for looking at RDP information because they can often go back years. Let's look at these. So now we can see that RDP, so the administrator account was physically, mouse, keyboard, they could see the screen, they were RDP'd into the domain controller, and as well as the Exchange server and even the endpoint. And it was coming from, most of the time it looks to have been coming from, those are, I think that's the Exchange server. Yeah, that's the Exchange server, that IP address. So again, more signs. Actually, no, sorry, that's the DC. So yeah, they've been moving around onto a few different machines. Let's go and have a look at the Exchange admin account, because that was the one that we saw have some of the tools in its downloads folders. So Exchange admin. Now that's interesting. I've also just realized that I haven't sorted this in date order. So let's just put the newest at the top. Okay. So now we're looking at the Exchange admin account, logging into Exchange. That time there, probably won't remember, but that time is after the web shells were created, but it's before the ransomware attack. So that's a very key time period for activity like this. The other very interesting thing I can see here is that source IP address. So you notice most of these actually have an IP, actually some of them have an IP address. Most of them have actually got this. Now that is something I recognize. I won't bother explaining why it's that number, but when we see that, it normally means the attacker has been logging in using a legitimate tool called ngrok. So it's a perfectly nice tool to use. I use it actually. It's ngrok ngrok.exe normally, and you can go ngrok.com, and it basically is a tool for opening up a tunnel on a machine back to wherever you are at the moment. So they can set up this ngrok session or token that allows them to forward traffic to this machine. So at your end, being the attacker, you log into your ngrok account, you give it a token, and it says, well, I can see I'm receiving traffic from a machine with that token, so I'm going to forward you on via RDP to that. And now you as the attacker have got RDP access to this machine. Even if the customer doesn't have RDP enabled on the machine or anything like that, this is them gaining access to the machine over RDP straight through your firewall. So
right, because it's an outbound connection, right? So it's usually those are allowed. So it's essentially a tunnel within a tunnel that lets the attacker go back in after they've established persistence.
Yeah. So now we've got signs of the attacker maybe using TeamViewer, maybe using ngrok, and of course the web shell for initial access as well. We suspect that there's lots of different things going on here. And we know obviously how they deployed the ransomware, but we're still concerned about what else they may have done on the network. They may have moved to the file server, may have taken data. So there are still further things to investigate on this, but we've now got a really good idea of how this attack worked, and we can feel more confident that we've begun to kick the attacker out of the network. Obviously, this discovery of potential use of ngrok is concerning because we don't know if that's still in use, if it's hiding somewhere. They could have renamed it. It can blend into normal traffic very easily. So there's still a lot of concern here that the attacker may still have access.
Yeah, that's something I kind of want to get at. Is obviously anybody that's been working in IT, one of the most important mantras is keep good backups. And this is obviously the same sort of idea that the attackers have, is they have backups of ways of getting into a machine. As you mentioned, they've got the initial proxy logon web shell, they've got TeamViewer, they've got ngrok, and who knows what else. So when you guys are looking at investigating this sort of stuff, do you guys tend to seek out who's logged on from where and then kick them off and just look for a lot of different methods that they might have left behind to gain access back?
Yeah, luckily a lot of attackers are sort of creatures of habit, so they tend to use the same tools over and over again. So that can certainly make it easier. Obviously, we always have to be looking out for things we've not seen before and new tools being used in different ways as well. So things like AnyDesk, TeamViewer, and even ngrok, and of course just RDP out to the external internet. All of these things could potentially be used. I remember in a Conti ransomware attack we investigated a while back, they actually set up 7 different backdoors into the environment. So they got in through proxy shell and installed their web shell. The very first thing they did after that was set up a completely different type of web shell in a completely different area on the Exchange server. So if anyone was looking, proxy shell, looking at the vulnerable Exchange version, things like that, it was relatively easy to find that first web shell. The second web shell, that was a bit more hidden. But then they also installed Tira, which is another remote access tool. They installed AnyDesk, and then they used the penetration testing tool or hacking tool, Cobalt Strike, as well as setting up another DLL file that would make a connection out to their environment. So they had all these different methods of persistence into an environment. So if even half of them got taken down, they could still launch a second attack, days or weeks later. And we've seen groups come back months after the attack because one of those methods was not identified, and they thought it's time to have another go.
Yep. Either hit them up for some more ransom or steal some more data. One of the things that you did early on that I meant to actually ask you about is the ASP file on the Exchange server. When you were looking at that, specifically the file creation time for proxy shell, you noted the first time on disk of that particular file, or essentially the time where it was created. Why is it that important? Why is it so important to sort of determine what the likely ingress point is and the time of that that attack? Like when you're doing your investigation, why is identifying a point in time so important?
Yeah, I mean, so what we can see here is this is that ASPX file. This is that web shell being detected in the first place at 12:56 on the 20th. But we've got to remember this is when Sophos was installed. We ran a scan, we found the file. That's good news. We found it, we removed it. But we don't know how long it was there. So we wanted to find that out. We did find that out in the previous session. It had been created at the beginning of the attack, basically. Having that time frame allows us to concentrate on that area. Instead of looking through 2 years worth of logs, we can concentrate on the last 24 hours, the last 48 hours, or maybe it's the last 2 months, but we have that reference point of this is when it likely started, so concentrate on this area. We then always have to remember that we might be wrong, and it may have started earlier, and the thing we're looking at for initial access may actually be a completely different attacker, and we're dealing with 2 different incidents at the same time. That actually happens more than you'd think. So we have to take what we know and have to keep sort of zooming out and looking at a wider time range, just make sure actually this error message we're seeing now, this admin that logs in at 2 a.m. over RDP, actually he does that every week because he goes and runs the Windows updates or whatever he needs to do. So that's actually perfectly normal. So we always have to keep that in mind, but having that time frame to narrow down our searches also can dramatically speed up an instant response.
Yeah, it's super important to have a baseline of what's normal on a particular network.
Mm-hmm.
One of the other things that I noted is that the extension that was sort of used for all the files seemed to be the same. Like ransomware obviously usually changes the encrypted file extension to either something random or a word or something like that. Have you found that attackers use the same extension within a specific attack on all systems in an environment, on all their victims, on only some of them? What's your experience on how that's used?
Yeah, so in this scenario, we found that the extension was .pwn. So you can see this, it was a JPEG file. Now it's a .jpeg.pwn. The reason why they do that, it has changed over the years on the actual names they would use and if it's random or something like pwned. First of all, you've got to remember that the victim needs to understand they've been attacked. They need to see how bad the damage is. You can't expect someone to pay a $10 million ransom and they don't know why they need to pay it. If you didn't have that extension on the file to indicate it, yes, you may no longer have the same icons in these files, but you might have to double click on each one to see if it does open or not. It's a very manual and time consuming way to work out how badly you've been affected. So by changing that extension, it becomes immediately clear. You can run a command on the machine to just see how many files have that extension. So that helps with the impact and the fear that they can put into the victims. Now, a lot of ransomware groups, they will have a specific extension they use, .locked or .encrypted or .pwned or whatever it is. Often it's the name of the ransomware itself. In fact, it's often the extension that they put on the files which gives the ransomware their names. And that's part of their brand image. They want victims to know who has hit them. So they can go onto Google and they can search the name and they can read all the horror stories of what this group may have stolen. But importantly, they can also read that if you pay the ransom, you do get a decryptor, which is normally one of the most common questions we face. If we pay, will we get our files back? And the answer is normally yes, to an extent. It's certainly not a magic wand that just makes everything suddenly unencrypted. It can still take days or weeks to recover all your data, and there will be a failure rate. Maybe it's a 50% failure and you only get half your files back. Maybe it's higher, maybe it's lower. But they want people to know that if you pay, you will get something. Then you've got the groups like we would class as a ransomware as a service. So the people that are actually making the ransomware aren't the ones that are actually launching the attack. It's their affiliates that are doing it. So those affiliates go out and do the different attacks and they get a commission for any ransoms paid. When you're doing running a platform like that and you have all these different affiliates doing all these different attacks, you need a way of keeping track of the individual attacks so you know who to pay, basically their commission. So having a unique extension per attack can help with that as well.
So part of it's notoriety, part of it's essentially just keeping track of money owed to affiliates.
Yeah.
And part of it is
use,
yeah, and just doing it in general is more to indicate the severity of the impact.
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
that's really insightful. Thank you for that. Have you got anything else to show us, or shall we wrap up?
That I think will do for today. But as I said, you've got a good idea of what happened in the attack now, but there are all these unanswered questions. Do they have other methods into your network? We've kicked off, we've isolated the Exchange server, and we've still got potential use of TeamViewer. We've still got potential use of ngrok. Plus, maybe there's something else we haven't seen any signs of yet. And we still don't know if they took any data. So the investigation is not done for sure, but we've
Wonderful.
made a good bit of headway.
Wonderful, wonderful. We'll look forward to it. Well, thank you very, very much for taking the time today, and thank you everybody for watching, and have a great one.
Thank you.
はい、ということで、ちょっとすみません、ちょっと今日も、先週よりちょっと長めな動画になってしまったんですけども、お話のところ聞いていただきましたと。で、調査のところで、まだまだ今回の場合は、ラピッドレスポンスというところで、簡単に言えば、火が上がっているところに対して消火活動を行うような形というところで、まず消火をしようというところを主眼において、どういう調査をして、まず火を消すっていうところ、それは先週のところであったんですけども、でそこから、どういった経路で、火元の特定というか、じゃあなんでそんなこれが起こったのかという話で、調べていくっていうところを、ちょっと実演しながらやっていたところになっています。で先ほど、話にも出てた通り、そういった、ジャーナルデータを取っているということで、ソフォスの XDR でジャーナルデータを取ってますので、そこの履歴を追っかける、その情報から何が起こってたのかというところを調べていくっていう話にはなってるんですけども、じゃあそういった機能があればあるほど、要は手がかりになる情報が、どんどん後で調べることができるというようなところが、今の、特に XDR っていう風ですね、他の機器のところの情報もちょっと調べてやるっていうようなところの大きなメリットになります。なので、今日聞いている皆さんのところも、XDR とか EDR とあると何がいいのっていうところになりますと、要は証拠とかそういった記録が残るので、何が起きてたのかがちゃんと調べられること、データを元にして調べられることということになります。よく監視カメラの話が一番分かりやすいかなと思うんですけども、監視カメラ、監視ポイント増えれば増えるほど、どこでどういったことが起きてたのかが、分かるっていうのは皆さんも想像できるかなと思います。なので、監視してないポイントを泥棒が通過してたら、そこをいつ通過したのか分からないっていう話にもなりますけども、防犯カメラがあれば、そこに誰かが何時に通過したっていうことが分かるよねっていうのと、同じようなことですね、今回のこういったところ、調査にあった XDR 使って調査するというところはというような話になってましたと。あとは経験とかですね、さっきランサムウェアの被害のところで、攻撃のタイプによって拡張子の変わり方が違うっていうのは、実際最近のインシデント事例だと6ビット 2.0 ですと、なんとかドットロックっていう形で、暗号化するっていうところもあったりもしますし、昔だとロッキーランサムウェアだとドットロッキーとかっていうところも皆さん明るい、そういったところの記憶があるのかなというふうに思いますと。ではですね、後半ですね。またちょっと先週のおさらいなんですけども、今回、少しもし潰れていたので、ちょっと見づらいところがあったかもしれないんですけども、ラピッドレスポンスで使っていた XD のクエリというところは、GitHub から入手可能ですというところで、URL も書いたんですけども、GitHub、ソフォスラピッドレスポンスって検索するとですね、上位に上がってきますので、見ていただければなと思います。この画面が出てきますというところですね。で、ここからはですね、先ほどのところ、動画の中の解説の中でも触れてた、いくつかいろんなクエリ使ってこうやって調べていってとかっていうことを、やっていたんですけども、実際同じようなことをするとなると、エクスチェンジの脆弱性をついてというところでいろんなものを消費しなきゃいけないので、なかなかそれは実現できないんですけども、一方で、前回の第1回目のフィードバックで一番多かったものがですね、脅威ハンティングの XDR のツールのそのハンティングの仕方というところを一番聞きたいと。できることは1時間枠じゃなくて、それだけでもいいから、別途勉強会してほしいとか、そういった要望とかが一番多かった、フィードバックとして多かったの ですと。なので、今回この後、三浦の方からですね、前回のフィードバックに対する、ちょっとお答えというわけじゃないですけども、脅威ハンティングの簡単な始め方というところで、三浦の方にバトンタッチしながらですね、こんな形で、調査を進めていくんですよというところを、解説していただこうと思いますので、じゃあ、三浦さん、バトンタッチしてもいいでしょうかね。
はい、承知いたしました。はい、画面見えておりますでしょうか。
はい、お願いします。
はい、ありがとうございます。はい、それではですね、先週のフィードバックいただきまして、ちょっと高度なことをラピッドレスポンスチームがしているのは分かりますと。ただちょっと、実際に XDR が有効なのは分かるけども、じゃあ、ちょっとそれお客さんに説明するには高度すぎるかな、みたいなお声をいただいたというところからですね、前提の知識とか勘とかなくてもですね、簡単に始められる XDR使ったスレッドハンティングのですね、ことはじめということで、ちょっと私の方から説明をさせていただきたいと思います。で、今ご覧になっているこちらの画面ですね、この上の方にも書いてありますけども、脅威解析センター、ソフォスセントラルにログインしていただいて、トップページから脅威解析センターを押していただいて、で、検出というところですね。ここを、クリックしていただければ、ソフォスの、データレイクにアップロードされている、いろんな情報の中から、これちょっと侵害されているんじゃないかっていう情報を自動的にまとめて、このリスクラベルつけて表示されているような場所になります。で、今回ちょっとサンプルとしてこのリスクレベル6、割とやばいんじゃないですかといったものを見ていきながら、実際じゃあちょっと気になるところを調べていくというようなところの最初の部分をご紹介したいと思います。で、まずですね、これを見ていくときにどこを見ていこうかなと思ったところで、ここですね、まずこのマイターアタックフレームワークでいうどういった攻撃されているのかというところがここに出てきます。ここを読むとプリビレッジエスカレーションと出ているので、権限昇格されている、システム権限、掌握されてしまったんじゃないですかというようなところがわかります。次ですね。じゃあ、昇格されてしまったのはどのデバイスかっていうところになるんですけども、デバイスリスト、ここを見ていきましょう。そうすると、WD10 の S03 っていうデバイス、およびさらに1件、下の方を見ていくと、もうちょっと詳細ですね。Windows 10のエンタープライズの、OS のものが2つ、同じような被害に遭ってますよと、これまとめられて表示されております。で、次、時間ですね。これ実際いつ起こりましたかというところで、5月6日の14時19分。で、最終更新が14時59分というところで、この開き何なんだろうっていうこのあたり見ていくと、この14時19分ですね、にこの S02 という方が、この攻撃にあっていて、で、ちょっと時間空いて14時59分にこの S03 があっていると。いうので、この更新された日時、この時間がわかるというところになります。次何を見ていくかというと、じゃあ実際にこの権限昇格に使われたプロセスですね。ここになります。で、実際ここで使われていたのはパワーシェル。先ほどのラピッドレスポンスでもパワーシェルというような言葉が出てきましたけども、パワーシェル今回も使われてしまったというところがわかります。で、次に、この攻撃に使われたプロセスの、ハッシュですとか、あとは機械学習のスコアやソフォスラボのスコアっていうのが出てきます。で、説明もあった通り、既存の Windows ですでにインストールされている正常なアプリケーションを使った攻撃というのが流行っておりますので、ここのスコアもですね、無害の可能性ですとか、信頼できるアプリケーションというふうに表示されていることがわかります。で、次、親プロセスですね。はい。親プロセスがイベントビューアーとなっております。ですので、このパワーシェルをキックしたのはイベントビューアーなんだなっていうところで、そういったことって通常あり得るのだろうかというような、ちょっと気になるところが出てきました。また最後にコマンドラインですね。コマンドライン、ここ、ちょっと今ちっちゃいので、後でまた詳しく見ていきますけども、ざっくり見た感じ、パワーシェルを使われていて、で、ヒドゥンなので、プロンプト表示しないで、で、なんかこう、引数がずらずらずらと出ていると。これもちょっと後で見る必要があるかなというところで、まず最初に、この気になっていたイベントビューアーの方ですね、見ていきたいと思います。 で、ソフォスデータレイクにアップロードしている、ジャーナルデータをアップロードしていくときにですね、各プロセスに対してこのソフォスの PID というものを付与しています。ですので、この PID を起点として、このプロセスがどんなことをしてたのかっていうのをさらに深掘りしてクエリをかけていくことが可能です。この青いポッチが3つあるところですね。ここをクリックすると、さらにこの PID に対してクエリをかけますよっていうようなウィンドウが出てきます。今回に関しましては、このネットワークアクティビティ、つまりこのイベントビューアーがどんなネットワークアクティビティをしたのかっていうところを検索していこうというところでございます。で、ここをクリックするとですね、先週私が紹介したような、このライブディスカバーでクエリをかけるところの画面が出てきます。このネットワーク PID を元としたネットワークアクティビティの検出というのも、デフォルトで準備されているクエリになります。で、実際に表示されていた内容を見て、何か怪しいところがないかなっていうのを見ていくと、はい、ここですね。リモート IP というところに 11.11.10.201 という IP アドレスが出てきました。こちらのローカル IP というのは、先ほど侵害された、Windows 10の IP ですね。で、どうも同じ、スラ24だったりとかすると同じ IP アドレス、ローカル IP だよねっていうところから攻撃されている。つまりここがイベントビューアーをなんか起動してなんかしたんじゃないかっていうところがなんとなく見えてきました。で、今回これ私が攻撃用のサーバーとしてローカルで作ったものなので、ローカル IP なんですけども、もしこれがグローバル IP だったりした場合ですね、さらにここからこのポッチ、クリックすることによって、このファイアウォール通過している、この IP を使ったファイアウォールを通過したクエリをさらに深掘りしていくようなことができたりとか、あとはこっちの右側ですね、サンズとか、外部のですね、サードパーティーのウェブサイトに対して、コマン C2 サーバーとして知られているものですかみたいな検索もできます。ただ、今回に関しましては、ローカルの IP アドレスということが分かったので、とりあえず今ここでできることとしては、セントラルが、とりあえず認識しているIP 端末なのかなというところを見ていたりします。で、ざっと見ていくと、11.11.10.201 というのは、セントラル上では管理していない、インターセプト X が入っていない、サーバー端末なんだなというところまでは分かりました。で、次、コマンドラインですね。ここですね、コマンドラインの引数として、先ほどのヒドゥンとかあったんですけども、次このカッコのところの、コマンドを評価してくださいっていうところで、パス引数で書いてあります。なんとなく見たことあるような人もいらっしゃるかなと思いますけども、この表記、レジストリっぽいなと思われる方もいらっしゃると思います。もちろんレジストリとなんとなく分からなかった場合でも、とりあえずここ怪しいので、もうただ、これを Google で検索かけてみたりします。そうするとですね、検索して、もう最初のページですね、に、アクセスしてみると、先ほどのレジストリで、コントロール F 検索すると、このページにレジストリのパスがあることが伺えます。で、英語のページだったので、これ日本語訳して詳しく見ていきましょう。そうするとですね、これ要約しますと、イベントビューアーの脆弱性で、先ほどのレジストリのパスに対して、イベントビューアーではなく別のバイナリ、またはスクリプトの場所をこのレジストリに追加されると、UAC プロンプトが表示されることなく実行できますと書いてあります。でこの UAC プロンプトとは何かというところなんですけども、Windows とかで AD 管理されてたりとか、するとですね、ユーザー権限でアプリケーションをインストールするようなときに、これ以上は管理者のアカウントの権限が必要なので、管理者のアカウントパスワードを入れてくださいっていうようなプロンプトが出るかと思います。それですね、UAC。 で、バイパスということなので、管理者権限の、プロンプトを表示させずに、管理者権限として、アプリケーションを実行することができる、イベントビューアーの脆弱性ですというような、ことがわかります。はい。もちろん、ここからどんどん調べていく必要があるんですけども、少なくともここまでで分かることをまとめました。要点としては、ローカルの IP である 11.11.10.201 から攻撃されているというところ、あとはイベントビューアーの脆弱性を突かれたというところが、この段階で分かりました。で、実際にその原因ですけども、201に関しては、追加調査が絶対必要です。201っていうこのサーバーが勝手に誰かが作ったのか、もしくは運用管理全くしていなくて、もともとあったけども、全然みんな気にしなかったから乗っ取られたのか、その辺は調べていく必要があると思います。でイベントビューアーの脆弱性に関しましては、これは古い Windows 10のビルドだということをさらにググっていけば出てきます。ちなみにですね、これは2017年の1月に Windows アップデートで、修正されている脆弱性になります。ということは、もうだいぶ Windows アップデートしていない端末だったっていうことがわかりますね。今できる対処としては、この2つになると思います。とりあえず、追加調査するにしても、今現在進行形で、被害、拡大する可能性があるので、とりあえず、この201のサーバーに対しては、ファイアウォールポリシーですね、Windows ファイアウォールだったりとか、途中でもしルーターとか挟んであるのであれば、ファイアウォールのポリシーで、ここにアクセスできない、ここからアクセスさせないというようなことをしましょう。で、イベントビューアーの脆弱性ですね。これはもう Windows アップデートしましょう。というところがわかります。これをした上で、さらに調査を進めていくのがいいんじゃないかなというところで、少なくともここの段階で私が今回のケースとして、これしてますかって言えるところとしてはサイバーハイジンと、締めくくりたいなと思っております。これは昨今よく聞くようになった言葉だったりとかするんですけども、アプリケーション、OS 最新化してますか？また、ちゃんと、IT インフラのですね、各機器、管理してますかというところですね、ここをちゃんと、衛生状態を保って管理していれば、今回の、権限昇格、防げたんじゃないですかというようなところまでが分かります。はい。で、これから先ですね、さらに気になったところを調べていくというところで、なんとなくその前提の知識なかったとしても、ソフォスの検出というところで、自動的に怪しいというところが出てくるので、そこからわからないところをとりあえず調べていくというところでも、だいぶそのスレッドハンティングのその初級者として始めていくことができるということがお分かりいただけたのではないかなと思います。はい、私の方からは、説明以上になります。杉原さん、お返しいたします。
はい、皆さんありがとうございます。こんな感じでスレッドハンティングの部分と、あとは最近出てきましたサイバーハイジンというところで、そもそもスレッドハンティングする前にですね、全部防御できれば、一番いい話ですので、そういった観点でも、あとは、それでもなかなか全部が全部入って止められるというわけではないというところもありますので、そういったのでうまく活用していただければなというふうに思います。ということでですね、画面映りましたかね。ちょっと最後の今日の最後のちょっと方に移りたいと思います。よいしょ。ということでですね、今回、前回のフィードバックのところで、XTR 使ったハンティングの仕方について学びたいっていう、もっと知りたいっていう、フィードバックがありましたという話で、今、三浦の方から説明をいたしましたと。あともう一つですね、MTR というサービス、マネージスレッドレスポンスのサービスについて、詳細が聞きたいという方も結構多かったですと。でただ、先週ウェビナーの予告しまして、で今週開催したんですけども、そこに参加できなかった方に対してですね、他に見れる方法ないのかなというところについてのご案内になります。でこちら、YouTube にですね、ソフォスジャパンチャンネルというものがございまして、でそこにですね、ソフォス MTR のサービスというところの、これ3月に実施したウェビナーの内容なんですけど、こちらの方を公開しております。 なので、もし MTR について何か知りたいというところがありましたら、こちら YouTube チャンネルございますので、こちらの方をご参照いただければ幸いです。だいたい30分ぐらいの、ものになってます。これを見ると、サービスの内容というところが分かりますので、そちらの方をご参照いただければなというふうに思います。ということで、2回にわたりまして、スレッドハンティングアカデミーの Day1、Day2 というふうな形で書かせていただきました。また、こういったウェビナー等々、他のものを続けていきますので、またお時間ありましたら、ご参加いただければなというふうに思います。また、アンケート等々ありますので、また、なんかフィードバックありましたら、ぜひコメントいただければなというふうに考えております。では、本日のスレッドハンティングアカデミーの Day2 の内容は以上となります。皆さん、ご参加いただきましてありがとうございました。今後ともそこそよろしくお願いいたします。どうもありがとうございました。失礼いたします。
失礼いたします。